long story short, that was a very fruitful and amazing time. And Malcolm also started to make statements like, I don't care what color you are, I'll work with anyone who's trying to change the wretched condition of this earth. You see what I'm saying? So he kind of, but again, it's wrong to just say, sometimes he's presented as like this very like universal, like love everyone. Like he's still committed to uplifting his people. He's still understanding that racism is very real and that he wants to work for his people, African American people. And though he's treated as a dignitary and a head of state and honored, his people are still suffering, right? Something that, Muhammad Ali also talked about. He's a superhero, all around the world, but look at how his people are treated. And so, he's working for that. So long story short, as everyone knows, Malcolm was assassinated, like martyred, and it was people from the Nation of Islam that pulled the trigger, but the FBI knew about it and let it happen, and were probably very happy that it happened, obviously, that he was becoming a problem. So that ended his life. And now if we're going to move into that kind of hip-hop and all that, there's kind of like the post-Malcolm, what happens? Well, the head of the nation after Elijah passes away a few years later is undisputably W.D. Muhammad, his son, right? And immediately in his first speech, he is going to bring the Nation of Islam into Sunni Islam. So he rapidly changes a lot of things. He even changes the name of the Nation of Islam to, I forget exactly, but it was kind of like something about the global Muslim community in the West or something. He had this very kind of this idea that we're the Muslims in the West. And most people follow him into that. And this goes on for 2 years, and he's rapidly changing things. And he's disbanding the fruit of Islam, the kind of paramilitary. People that had high rank and position are all of a sudden not anymore. He's changing things very rapidly. So most people go along with it, but some people aren't very happy with it. And so 2 years later, people approach Farrakhan and ask him to kind of revive the old Nation of Islam. And Farrakhan, as you know, is still living and is the leader of the Nation of Islam that kind of revived on the old Elijah Muhammad's teachings. And whereas Imam W.D. Muhammad's community still flourished, Imam Muhammad passed away in the early 2000s, I believe. I don't know the exact year. But very flourishing community in all major cities, and what encouraged people to study Arabic, encouraged people to read the Quran and be able to access the Quran themselves. They were praying, fasting as Muslims. But he also did something very interesting in that W.D. Muhammad, he wasn't he was very respectful of his father. And he said, what my father taught was the stepping stone to get us to Islam. That we needed actually this idea that before we could believe that we're equal with everyone, we had to believe that we're better than white people and that they're devils. For the pendulum to swing back, you see what I'm saying? And the nation, they used to observe they wouldn't observe the fast of Ramadan, but they would do a fast in December. And he taught that was to cleanse us of worshiping a white Jesus in December. You see what I'm saying? Of Christmas. So then he instituted. So anyway, it's very fascinating. And there's a lot that could be said. Another thing that happens after the day Malcolm dies, Huey Newton, I believe it was, he wrote, that he ran through the streets of Oakland crying and screaming, right? And that was the day that the Black Panther Party was formed in his mind. So the Black Panthers take off on this, where Malcolm left off, very inspired by Malcolm. And in fact, Malcolm was caught, there was a white woman who, they had Malcolm over to dinner like a politician, and after drinking tea and after she left, she said about Malcolm, he was like having a Black Panther in your living room. So he was like, no, that, you know, perhaps it came from that. I'm not sure. So then another important thing is there's something called, is this too much history? It's a lot of history, right? No. There's something called the 5 percenters, 5% nations of gods and earths. And this is very important for hip hop. Mm-hmm. So there was someone named Clarence 13X, and he was in the nation. He knew Malcolm. And he was kind of like, I believe, he was kind of banished from the nation for various infractions because the nation was very strong. You can't smoke cigarettes, you can't gamble, you can't drink alcohol, you can't do drugs, you can't hit your wife, you can't fornicate, you can't. There was a lot of, you know, and they were very strict as well. They enforced them. And Clarence 13X, he liked the teachings, the knowledge, but he didn't like all the rules, right? He was into gambling, smoking reefer, drinking alcohol, these type of things. And so he kind of created a spin-off group called the 5% Nations of Gods and Earths. And the 5 percenters, as they're called for short, the name 5 percenters comes from something that was taught by Elijah Muhammad, which is that, and it's very fascinating, is that 10% of the population of Earth are the corrupt, slave-making bloodsuckers of the poor. Right? They control the resources and they manipulate people that are ignorant and don't understand what's going on, and they're essentially the devilish people. Then the 85% of people, the vast majority, are the dumb, deaf, and blind. They're just ignorant. They don't know what's going on. They're not very educated. They are the ones manipulated by the 10%. And then the 5% are the poor, righteous teachers. Those who know the truth, those who are enlightened, those who are awakened, and they fight intellectually and spiritually to awaken the other 85 and to battle the 10%. So this was kind of the teaching of the Nation of Islam, that the Nation of Islam is going to be the 5% and to spread that. So the 5 percenters took that, and they also, something Clarence didn't like is the way that kind of like their Fard was deified, and that Elijah was honored as like a prophetic figure. He emphasized that, like, no, you are God, you are God, you are God. Everyone has access to God. Like, everyone has what we might say in the Islamic context, nafas ar-Rahman in the Quran. Everyone has, Adam had the breath of ar-Rahman, right? That you have the spark, like your soul is from God. You have a direct connection to God. And so he spoke a lot to kind of street people in the street. And so a lot of the, you know, criminals, hustlers, the kind of Detroit Reds, they became 5 percenters because they didn't really have to necessarily transform their behavior as much as they would have in the nation, but they could still have the knowledge and this righteousness and this idea, these concepts. So fast forward to the late 70s, and this is kind of the milieu in New York. This is like all just in the water in the black community, right? And, you know, this house parties and jams. So that the 5 percenters would actually do their congregation in the streets. It was called Parliament. And they would call it a cipher. That we're getting into a cipher, okay? And the cipher would be dropping knowledge, right? Kicking jewels, rapping. Right, rapping first just meant we're rapping, slang for talking. But this is actually hip-hop kind of grows out of this. And most of the foundational people in hip-hop were part of this 5% group, a lot of them. So you have, at the time, graffiti becomes a big thing. And it's a way to get your name up. It's a way to create art. It's a way to beautify the ugliness of the urban slums. And then you have breakdancing, right? Just using the street as your stage. And then you have DJing, right, in the park jams and the parties. And then you have the MC, which originally was very, you know, you're kind of like just the crowd control at the party, saying a few things, this and that, but it develops into the art of rapping, MCing. And it was first Africa Bambaataa, who was like he was like an activist and an organizer in the streets and involved in gangs as well. And he said, this is hip hop. He was the first one who gave it the term. He said, all these are elements of hip hop, right? Graffiti, rapping, DJing, b-boying, which is breakdancing. And then he said the fifth element is knowledge, right? He emphasized that. And he said, we're going to create the Zulu nation, right? We're going to unite all the tribes and gangs and different street gangs. And just like the Zulus united against the British, we're going to unite and be, you see what I'm saying? So all people, this is kind of the foundation of hip hop. And the major hip hop artists in the beginning, people like Rakim, 5%er, right? His name was Rakim Allah. And people like KRS-One, knowledge reigns supreme is what his name stands for, this idea. You know, of course, Public Enemy, right, who become, you know, hits. They got Malcolm X hats. They got Fruit of Islam on stage with them when they're performing in their FOI, the whole thing, the whole get up. And Malcolm X posters on in their music videos. I mean, it's very... and what happens through this is now all of a sudden it's leaving the black community as hip hop becomes pop culture. And so you have individuals from all over, from different races, white people in the suburbs, influenced by this and being exposed to this. And then the next generation that actually like carries the pop wave, people like Tupac, Nas, Jay-Z, all of them come out of the same kind of sphere. Like Jay-Z still wears the 5%er gold necklace. Nas still references this thing, right? He said in the hood is 5%ers, but something must have got in us because all of us turned to sinners, right, on his first album. All these, he references Malcolm in his first album. All these things. Tupac, his mother was a Black Panther. Their last name was Shakur, Tupac Shakur. All of this is coming out of this whole movement. And so then someone who's coming up in the 80s and the 90s, like myself, I was born in 84. I was raised in Seattle. I was not raised necessarily in the hood. I was raised in the city in like a working class, middle class, mostly white, but there was kind of diverse neighborhood. And, you know, hip hop was what was cool to all of us. And, you know, at the public school, people were being bussed in from the inner city. It was breakdancing, emceeing, hip-hop. Like, my whole world, what was cool to me before I understood anything about race or anything was basketball, football, and hip-hop. So all of my people I'm looking up to are mostly black people because basketball, football, and hip-hop. And all the people around me who were all different races and colors and classes, mostly white, were like me too. I wasn't like an outlier in that sense. Like, that was just what was, that was popular culture at that time. And so, because we're running short on time, you see, and it's important to remember in the early 90s, you didn't, like, maybe there was some silly, like, Puff Daddy stuff on you know, very pop hip-hop. But you didn't have to scratch very far to get to this. You see what I'm saying? In the sense, like, Tupac was on the radio, Nas was on the radio, you know, Tribe Called Quest was on the radio, you know. And so there was a lot of, like, stuff that wasn't too far removed from this message. And in reflecting on this, I realized, like, hip-hop, it has it all. It has all stages of Malcolm's. So there's a lot of, like, Detroit Red in hip-hop, right? That people are still in that, like, you know what I mean? But there's a lot of also Malcolm X's, like, political-minded. And there's also Hajj Malik Shabazz, people that are, you know, what you could say, Sunni Muslims, people like Mos Def, Lupe Fiasco, Tribe Called Quest, many people. It goes on and on and on. And it's important to understand that people that convert to Islam, and you see now, look at the Muslim community, outside of the black community alone, the main kind of like younger generation of imams. So people like Imam Sohaib Webb, people like Yahya Rodis, people like Osama Cannon, who's mixed, and others, they come to Islam through hip-hop, through this narrative. You see what I'm saying? And this is very important to understand and to remember. And even a lot of, I've spoken with a lot of born Muslims who were born and raised here. Islam was not necessarily cool. Their parents were from a different culture. It was hard to like reconcile it with growing up in America. But through hip hop and some of these rappers talking about Islam and stuff, it actually gave them a way to like be Muslim and be American. So this is really important to understand. There's a lot more that could be said, but because we're short on time, I just wanted to reflect on a few takeaways, and then maybe we could discuss more about hip hop if we have time. Yeah, I guess a few things. Just when I was in Egypt, I was studying Arabic, and all the Americans that were studying at Azhar and studying there, we would play basketball on Thursday nights. And one day we were all talking, it was like 10 of us, and these are like the people trained to be the next generation of imams. Many of them come back, including Imam Suhaib, Ubaidullah Evans, Jamal Diwan, people like that. And one brother said, he said, man, I wouldn't even have cared about Islam if it wasn't for hip-hop. And every single person said, me too. And I just reflected on it because these are the next generation of imams. So it's not a marginal thing, right? This is central to anyone, really Islam in America after the 80s especially. And Crooked Eye has a line which he said, which reflects on a lot of what hip-hop is. He said, I'm trapped somewhere between Malcolm X and Detroit Red, still chasing after D-Boy bread. And actually, I'm still like a drug dealing and trying. But this understanding that Malcolm represents like what true righteousness and true, there was in hip hop growing up, there's an idea like, and this came from the nation, that the fitrah of black people is Islam. And then as it spreads, this idea of the fitrah in general is just Islam. So this idea of people in the streets that I grew up around, their idea was like, I might not be righteous, I might not be like living right, I might not be fulfilling my true purpose, but if I do, I'm going to become Muslim. So that was just in the air, in the kind of water, you could say. So a few takeaways from Malcolm's life. Sorry to be so rushed. One I think is important for us as Muslims in America is to understand he created two organizations at the end. One was like within the Ummah and one was outside of the Ummah. And he had the wisdom that we have to work as Muslims to like make our communities more beautiful, educate ourselves, study Islam, preserve Islam, teach Islam. But we also have to be engaged in what's going on around us. And we have to unite with anyone who will stand on the principles that we share for justice, for equality, for mercy, for compassion, and whatever element that is. And that's really important because when you see someone like Donald Trump and what's happening now, Sherman Jackson said Muslims have a credibility gap. In other words, Muslims could get on TV and say, we're not terrorists, we're not this, no one believes you. People don't actually believe you. Why? Because there's a credibility gap, because they haven't seen Muslims necessarily standing up for other people, right? When Donald Trump was talking about Mexicans, Muslims didn't have much to say. But when he starts talking about Muslims, now we want to talk a lot about it, right? So this is really important, is to think about ways that we can benefit our ummah, but also ways that we can unite with people who are doing good things in our society. And that leads to the second point, which is that we need to be about principle more than you could say tribe. Right? Islam is not a tribe. Islam is a set of principles. So the causes that we need to be thinking about are based on the principles that our deen teaches us. For instance, is Palestine a Muslim cause? It's not a trick question. Yes.
It's a cause of justice.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Is Tibet a Muslim cause? The Tibetans had their land stolen by the Chinese. Is that a Muslim cause?
Yes.
Absolutely. Because it's a cause of justice, like our sister said. In other words, Palestine is not just a Muslim cause because it's Muslims being oppressed. But oppression is the issue. You see what I'm saying? You understand? And so we need to be about principles. And then what about the environment? Is that a Muslim cause? Yeah. Yes. What about, racial justice? Is that a Muslim cause? Yes. All these things are Muslim causes. It's not just if it affects Muslims. You understand? And once we do that and we live that, that's what will give us success. Because Malcolm started to speak beyond just the nation about what was affecting black people. That's when Malcolm became, this civil rights Malcolm. Most people that listen to Malcolm, they didn't become Muslim. But more people that listen to Malcolm became Muslim than anyone else. Because he was speaking about the reality, and he was like, I'm doing so as a Muslim. And he actually imagined that this African American Unity Organization would be led by Muslims. So the Muslims are going to unite. You see what I'm saying? So we need to be, as Muslims, on the forefront of these type of endeavors. closing remarks. Another thing, Malcolm was about thinking globally, but acting locally. So we need to be involved, again, this ties in, local causes, but having this global understanding and uniting with our people globally. Another thing that's really important is understanding and integrating. This is one of the main challenges of our age, of our era, I believe, is if you say that there's, kind of like indigenous Islam converts, black Muslims, predominantly, but increasingly others. And then you have, quote unquote, immigrant Muslims, people that were born Muslim that come from traditional Muslim lands. Until now, there's been very little work together. These have been separate universes. And it's natural for people to unite with people that have cultural similarities to them. It's not about shaming anyone. But strategically, it's problematic, especially because, as one of my teachers told me, like, he's an African-American teacher at Zaytuna College, and he said, no one is going to question whether I'm American or not. I'm African-American. Like, that's an authentic way of being an American. But all the Muslims on TV, they're saying, you're not American, go back home, this and that. Well, what about you having a representative on the television station who's born and been here and whose ancestors built this country? You see what I'm saying? Strategically, that would make a lot more sense. The other thing is the immigrant community came here, and alhamdulillah, because of the immigration, who was allowed to immigrate tended to be more wealthy and have a lot of resources, but not necessarily that credibility or the know-how cultural. So, you see what I'm saying? There's a cultural capital that African Americans have, and as you probably understand, African Americans are any like style, culture, art form, music, it comes from African Americans predominantly, and then it's adopted by the wider culture. So there's a secret in that Allah did it this way. Another thing, just to close, because I realize I'm probably is Imam Siraj Wahhaj, who came out of the nation and became one of the great Muslim scholars, he said, he was like, I was reflecting on the story of Moses and Khidr in Surah Al-Kahf, right? And Khidr is doing things outwardly against the Sharia, right? And Moses is outraged because that's the Sharia. Like, he's called to uphold the sacred law. But Allah had told Moses that he gave Khidr a special role to play. So it was right for Moses to be outraged, but at the same time, Khidr was doing something. That he had a role to play. And Imam Siraj said, my understanding, because Allah is God and Allah can do whatever He will, that there's a secret in what Allah did with the nation. And though Muslims are right to be to be offended by certain beliefs and certain theological things, honoring the legacy for the good that it did is very important. You see what I'm saying? And I truly believe that, because still, people like Farrakhan can call the March on Washington, and people come. He still has credibility within the African American community, and he still reaches out to rappers, and he still reaches out to more than rappers. But since we're talking about hip hop, he still has that credibility that Malcolm kind of carries. And then lastly, the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, let's end with him, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, as our master and guide. When he said, La ilaha illallah, to his people, he was saying the most revolutionary statement. He was saying there is no God but God. And these were people that believed in a multiplicity of idols. He was saying, that was like saying the sky isn't blue to them. He was fundamentally challenging their worldview. Now, if you were to go to an average person on the street today and you're saying there's no God but God, most people would actually agree with you and be like, okay, what's the point? What's your point? You see what I'm saying? So Dr. Sherman Jackson mentioned this, and he said, now, the question is, has La ilaha illallah become less revolutionary? And of course the answer is no. It's the most revolutionary, beautiful statement, most transformative statement ever at all times. But we failed to identify the idols of our time. Like the Prophet ﷺ was talking about the idols. Because do our people still have idols? Maybe not physical idols. Maybe some of them are physical, right? Once Lat and Lat and Manat, now Benzes and Maybachs, right? Or what have you. But the point is there's also psychological idols. And racism is one of the great idols of our time. This actually seeing one race as better, seeing whiteness as better. And it doesn't just affect people here. We all know the skin bleaching, industry in all of the Muslim world is multi-million-dollar industry. And this ingrained through colonization and all these things, self-hatred. So it's very Muslim to identify the idols of our time and to try to speak Islam at them. But we have to really critically think, as Sidi Jihad encouraged us to reflect on the Quran and what it means in our time, instead of just reflecting what it meant in the Prophet's time. Sallallahu alayhi wa sahbihi wa sallam. Any khair, any good that I said is from Allah. Any imperfection or falsehood or wrong statement is from myself, and I ask Allah's forgiveness.